Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought I'd show you a game I played in 2006 where I didn't play the start of the game all that well. I just got equality with white, playing against a friend of mine who's an expert. But then my opponent made an instructive mistake, and I kind of recognized, wow, if he does that, maybe I can get some sort of advantage. And I did by getting a queenside majority, which is not exactly the way I normally play chess. I like to play kind of exciting, aggressive chess. I'm not really much of a positional player, but I'll play whatever the board tells me to play. I think I'm a little bit like Boris Spassky that way. He liked to play aggressively, but if it was positional, he played positional. Not that our playing strengths are anywhere near equal. But I thought I'd show you this game because it's very instructive, and it's rare that you get to play a game where you get one of these long-term plans. Mostly you get these really short-term plans like how do I get my knight better, how do I get my rook on the open file, that kind of thing. But this is actually a game where I got kind of a long-term plan, and that's very unusual for me. So I thought it was instructive, and I thought I'd show it to you. All right, let's get going. This game I think was played at the Mainline Chess Club Championship in 2006. I was white. I opened English c4. My opponent played the very flexible knight f6. If I play d4 now, we get into Indian defenses to the queen's pawn game. I played g3. That's a move I first read about in a book by Andy Soltis, and then I bought another book by Grandmaster, the British Grandmaster. I'm blanking on his name right now. But then Grandmaster Marin wrote a 3-volume set on playing c4 and then g3. So that's kind of the standard now, is Marin's 3-volume series on c4 and g3. All right, so my opponent says, I'm just going to fianchetto on the king side, maybe set up a king's Indian setup. I fianchetto also. And I play knight c3 to discourage him, of course, from playing kind of Grunfeld kind of lines with d5. He castles. I played d3. This is a suggestion, I guess it was Grandmaster Gurevich maybe, was to play maybe d3 and wait to see whether he plays e5 or c5. Oh, it was Grandmaster Kostin and was the one who wrote the second book. Yeah, I'm trying to play a Botvinnik setup, but I'm trying to see if he's going to play e5 first, so I'm being flexible. In Kostin's book, he suggests that white does not play a Botvinnik setup if black's going to play a symmetric English. But in Marin's book, he says you can play a Botvinnik setup against c5 or e5 here. So I think this game was played before I had Marin's book, and I was waiting to see if black would play c5 or e5. So I played d3, kind of a waiting move, and he plays d6. And now I played Gurevich's suggestion, which is to continue to wait for what he does. I gave this position to Stockfish, and it suggested I play bishop d2 and wait. Gurevich suggested that you entice h6. Stockfish said to me that he didn't think that idea was the best idea, but at the time that was the suggestion. So I played bishop g5, h6, and then I played bishop d2. I could have played bishop d2 right away, and we'd reach the same position with the pawn on h7. So black plays c5, which is, again, if white's going to play the Botvinnik setup with e4, it's probably a little better for black to play c5 than e5. All right, so I switch now, and I don't play the Botvinnik. If I was going to play the Botvinnik, I would have played e4 and knight ge2, and that's kind of what Marin recommends. But Kostin said you shouldn't do that. So, as I said, this game was played in 2006, so I was still following Kostin's recommendations. And I played knight f3, knight c6, castle, rook b8. So here, with the pawns on c4 and c5, white's breaks moves are b4 and d4, and black's break moves are b5 and d5. And in this position, black's putting the rook on b8, getting ready for his break move with b5. Okay, so I played queen to c1, attacked the pawn on h6. I'm just trying to get his king up to h7. Then I'm going to probably play rook b1 and then play a3 and b4. King h7. a3, a6. Again, both sides are trying for their break on the b file. There's a lot of lines in the symmetric English where both sides break. For instance, there's lines where white would play like rook to b1, and then black would play b5, and you would take, they would take, you play here, they take, you take, and you get a symmetric position like this. But that's not what happened in this game. In this game, after I played rook b1, black played knight to d4. And now I made a mistake. Black's threatening to play knight to b3, winning the bishop pair. And the best way to stop that is to play my break move, b4, and just let the knight sit on d4. And I think if we ask the engine what the evaluation here is after b4, you can see it thinks that white has a little bit better than normal advantage of about half a pawn. It actually suggests that knight d4 was not the best move, that black should have just played the normal move, the break move, b5, with equality. So knight d4 is actually a mistake. So we actually get two positional mistakes here by the two players. Black makes a mistake by playing knight d4, and instead of playing b4 to give me the advantage, I take the knight. One way I describe this game is I played like an expert in the opening, and then I played like a master in the later part of the game. So this is part of my not playing the best moves. Knight takes d4, e takes d4. All right, so you might say, but Dan, you got him to get double pawns. Double pawns are bad. Well, yes and no. I mean, that extra pawn in the middle is holding up my whole center. It's guarding some key central squares. That pawn is not vulnerable. It's not on a semi-open file or anything. The fact that black has his pawns doubled here is really almost of no consequence. So I can't really take advantage of that in any way. All right, so he's threatening to take off my knight, and I play knight to d5. And black says, well, I'm perfectly happy to get a draw against Dan. I'll just keep trading off. So he plays knight takes d5. Now, if I double my pawns and open this file, that'll do nothing at all for me. So I take with the bishop, and he develops his bishop by hitting my rook. I could go back and offer the trade of bishops. I thought I would just hang around a little bit here. So I played rook to e1. Not that I'm really thinking of breaking with e3 and undoubling his pawns, but I could do that in the future depending on what he does. And I thought it was pretty equal whether I played bishop g2 or rook to e1. He plays e6, hitting my bishop. Again, I could trade bishops here. I decided to wait, play bishop f3, just overprotect my e-pawn for the moment. Again, bishop g2, perfectly good. These are all equal. The game is fairly equal. And now, basically, all black has to do here is kind of do nothing. One of the principles that we talk about in the opening is develop your rook to the same file your opponent has developed his queen. Well, my queen is now on the c file, so black should probably put a rook on the c file and get ready to maybe break by pushing these pawns. Instead, black plays probably the key move of the whole game, the move that really kind of defines what's going to happen, defines why I picked out this game. Black plays b5. Now, we talked earlier in the game that b5 was his break move, but that was when there were pawns on c4 and c5. You might say, well, what's the difference, Dan? It's still, he still has that pawn on d6. If you go past, he can still take it. So what's the difference? He's already played this move a6 and rook b8. He's setting up b5. Why shouldn't he play b5 here? And the answer is, once the black has traded this pawn and gone to d4, if he plays b5, I could actually strive for a long-term advantage here. What I can do is now take his pawn. And what that does is it creates a line of demarcation on the c file for the pawn structure. And on the left side of that line, I have a 2-on-1 majority for the endgame. And on the right side of that line, he just has double pawns. So he has what's called a crippled majority. He has 6 pawns to my 5. But his 6 pawns are unable to make a passed pawn. So he can't make a passed pawn, and I can. So that's what I did. He played b5, and I said, wait a second, that was a really good move before, but now it's not such a great idea. So I took the pawn. And now the engine says black should play his Zwischenzug. Instead of recapturing the pawn with the rook or the or the pawn, he should grab the file with the rook, and when I save my queen, then he should take the pawn, and he's got the file. So here black ends up making two minor mistakes in a row. His first mistake, which took him from equality to the worst position, was to play b5, and then when I took, he automatically recaptured with the pawn and didn't give himself the file, and that cost him another few tenths of a pawn. So the evaluation of Stockfish in those three moves were the game was equal. After I took his pawn, I was ahead by about half a pawn. And now when he didn't play rook c8, I'm ahead by almost a whole pawn. So now I'm sort of theoretically winning, but I have to come up with a plan. And the plan is very, very, very simple. I'm going to trade everything off on the open c file. I'm going to play b3. I'm going to play a4. I'm going to create an outside passed pawn there, or a passed pawn on the outside, maybe I should say. And I'm going to try to win with that pawn. And that plan is actually not that hard. So let's see how I do it. All right, so I play queen to c6. I just want to attack these squares, entice him to try to trade. Now he can't play rook to c8 because I can take his pawn on b5. So my plan with queen c6 is not to really attack him or come down and get those weak. It's just to force him to trade off by completely controlling the c file. All right, so my opponent in this position plays d5. He wants to keep my bishop away from that potential queening square and lock my bishop out of the game where the bishop's not very good. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, except for the fact that it just gives me another tempo here to grab the c file. And now I'm going to force those trades, and my outside pawn will be that much better, even though my bishop's out of the game. So I now take that rook on e1, which was doing nothing. Why don't I want to move my b rook? Because I'm going to play b3 and a4, and depending on what he does, I may end up with my rook on an open file, or I may end up behind the pawn. It, again, depends on how he plays it, but there's no reason not to move the rook on the e file now. So I go there, and of course he can neutralize the file, but even if he neutralizes it with a rook, I can take with the queen and trade off, but I really don't want to give him the file. So if he plays rook there, of course I'm going to take the pawn. I'm not going to trade. But if he plays queen there, then I can trade. All right, so let's see what happens. He plays bishop e5. He realizes he needs to get pieces over on the queen side where he has the deficit. So he tries to neutralize the fact that my bishop can come up by bringing his bishop into the area. All right, so I play bishop to b4. Hit the rook. Again, I'm not trying to hope that he doesn't move the rook or anything like that. I'm just trying to make my bishop more active, get it on the queen side where it has more things to do. He saves the rook with rook to e8, and I play b3. This is part of my basic plan that I formed all the way back when he played b5, which is control the c file, and then play b3, and then a4, and create an outside passed pawn there on the a file. All right, so black finally says, I have to do something. You're completely controlling the queen side. So he allows me to trade queens. He plays queen c8. And I said, all right, I'm in no hurry. If you want to move your queen away, that's fine, but I'm just going to play bishop g2. Now's the perfect time to trade bishops because I'm the one who's going to have that essential extra pawn on the outside. Even though we have equal pawns, his double pawns are really bad now. They cripple his majority. It was interesting that until he played b5, his double pawns were perfectly good. And once he played b5, the double pawns became part of a crippled majority. So it's amazing how one move can just change the game so much. All right, he decides to trade bishops. And then he decides to trade queens. And now my rooks can do some harm on the c file. But I have to watch out because after b4, I have to be able to save my bishop. He says, let's trade rooks. I said, well, okay, but if you do that, I want to keep control of the c file. He says, I realize this is a bad position. And he trades. All right, so now my plan again, I can't play a4 right away because he'll have a discovered attack against my bishop when he takes the pawn. So I'm going to have to move the bishop first before I play a4. But right now my pawn on a3 is perfectly safe. My pawn on b3 is shielded. I control the only open file. So even though the material is even, I'm pretty much winning. Let's see what Stockfish says in evaluation. I'd be surprised if Stockfish gives an evaluation less than about 1.5 here. Oh, there it is. So 1.9, and as he looks deeper and deeper, the number gets higher. That makes sense if you're winning. I'm up about two pawns here. Okay, so Stockfish says he should play King G8, and indeed he should. We'll see in a minute that he misses an idea. So he plays Rook to B7. Just trying to keep me off the 7th rank if he trades bishop somehow. Well, he's waiting to see what I'm going to do. As I said, I can't play A4, my bishop's hanging. So I play bishop C5, and now I'm threatening to play Rook B6 and hit the rook and the pawn, and the only way he can save the pawn would be to trade rooks. And in order for him to do that, he needs his king to get over here and stop this pawn. So the only move he can play here is to move his king to the G file. There's no reason to go to the dark square where my bishop is, so king to G8. So let's see what would happen if he plays King G8. I think the engine agrees, right? Mr. Engine, King G8? Yeah, see, King G8. So let's play out the game here with King G8, because that's the strongest defense, and that's the one where I have to really think to try to win. So let's have Stockfish play both sides here. We'll make the board as big as possible while still showing the moves. All right, so he has to play King G8, and let's turn on the engine. Stockfish says I should play Rook to C8, check, or play A4 right away. Let's look at Rook to B6. Does that still win? Yes, it does, but it's not accurate. In fact, my advantage is all the way down to... let's show you the reason why. Why Rook B6 doesn't work now. Rook takes, bishop takes, King F8, A4, and now it suggests he could just play King A8. I think he can take the pawn too. Pawn takes, King E8, A5, King D7, A6, King C6, Bishop C5. He can't take the bishop because I get a queen. Bishop F6, F3. I can't. If I push the pawn, his king is just in time, and that won't work. So here, the engine suggests King C7, H3, King C6, King F2. It says white's winning. Let's see the technique. It's always good to play out these games and learn the technique and see what would happen. King E1, Bishop E5. He really can't do much of anything. G4, Bishop checks, King D1. Black's kind of doing nothing here while white brings the king up. Bishop F6, King B3, H takes G4, H takes G4. Trying to get the outside pass pawn here doesn't work because of the bishop guarding the H4 square. E5. Now finally A7 to get the king out of there so the white king can come up. King B7, King B4, Bishop G7, King B5, Bishop F6. And now it wants to sacrifice the pawn to let the king come in and win the pawns. A8 Queen. Now black's up a pawn, but he's losing. King C6. The monster king is coming in. Bishop H8. He decides not to take the pawn right away. Bishop D6 to keep the king out. Bishop G7. Bishop E7. He's really playing all these subtle moves. He really doesn't have to. King to B8. And he still doesn't take the pawn. King to D7 to block out the king. He says it's really hopeless here. King to B7. G5. And now he's allowing F5, allowing en passant. Let's make a king move just to show you. King B6, King E8. If he plays king over again, king takes F7, hitting the bishop. Bishop is getting trapped, and white's winning. All right, let's go back to the game. So he has to bring his king in. Rook to B6 is threatening to trade the rooks or win that pawn, and he has to be able to trade rooks and stop the pawn, and therefore he has to get the king in the square. Now my opponent's rated, I guess his highest rating ever was around 2200. You know, this is not beyond his capability, but, at this point in the game, I'm not sure how much time he had left on the clock. I don't have the time stamping of the game in front of me. But he may have been a little short on time, and he may have missed this idea. It seems strange that a king on h7 has to go to g8 in this position to be able to get to the A file. But you really have to look ahead and see that you have to stop the threat of rook b6 from winning the game right away. So in this position, my opponent made a mistake. I mean, he is losing, but he plays rook to b8. And that means when I play rook to b6, which, by the way, the engine says I should play f4 first before playing rook b6, but I just played rook b6 right away. Rook b6, now he's between a rock and a hard place because his king is one square further away. Why is that important? Because now I can just push the pawn in and win the bishop. For instance, if he tries to save the pawn with rook takes, bishop takes, and now bring the king over, it's too late. a4, king f8. Well, let's trade pawns first. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, king f8, pawn here, pawn here. If he plays king here, I'll just get a queen in 2 moves because his king's one square further than the previous line. So, but he has to play bishop here. And now Stockfish is saying I don't have to play a7 right away. I can play f4, king d7, now a7, bishop takes, doesn't matter what he plays, king d6, bishop d4, and I'm up a whole bishop in the endgame with an easy win. Alright, so that's what happens when he plays rook to b8. He makes my job a lot easier. I was probably winning anyway, but after this, now he's between a rock and a hard place. If he trades rooks, I'm going to win his bishop in about another 4 moves. And if he doesn't trade rooks, I'll just win the pawn on b5. I'll be up a pawn. I'll have connected past pawns with an easy win. So he chooses the latter. He attacks my pawn on a3, but it's guarded by the bishop. I take the pawn. He plays g5. I play a4, brings the king up. I attack the d pawn again. Now it's attacked twice, guarded only once. He plays king f5. I bring my king up. He checks me. I bring the king back. He plays h5, and now I take the pawn. And I believe my opponent resigned here. No, he traded first. He took the bishop. I took with the rook, and now he resigned. I think he could have played one more move. He could have played rook to b8. Now, if his king was on d6, then b4 would be a super monster blunder, because if I play b4, he would play e5, and if his king was on d6, I would actually lose the rook. I would trap my own rook with this move b4. But how else am I going to save this pawn? The only move I can play is b4. Well, if I play b4 now, e5 doesn't trap the rook, but it does trade the d pawn for the b pawn. So if I take here, he takes here, and then I play a move like maybe a5, I'm up 2 pawns and I'm winning, but at least his rook can go behind the passed pawn. And, it would take some technique here, so he shouldn't resign if I do that. Now, I actually have a slightly better way to play it. Instead of trading pawns, I could sacrifice a pawn. So in this position, even though I'm only up 1 pawn, I could play a5 and just give him this pawn, and now my rook belongs behind passed pawns, and he'd have to come back to stop my pawn from queening. And this is a theoretical win, but again, it's not trivial. Now, I asked Stockfish which of the 2 things it would rather do. Let's show you here. If he plays rook b8, and we say, is it better to trade pawns or is it better to sacrifice a pawn? We can see the line here, the number 1 line, is to sacrifice the pawn and get the rook behind it. That's the best move, and I'm up 6, so the fact that he resigned isn't ridiculous. If instead I play b4 to save the pawn, and he plays e5 and I play rook takes d5, my only move, and he takes here, now my advantage is about a pawn less. In fact, Stockfish says I should play d4 here, offering some more trades. If he takes with the rook, I'll win with my outside passed pawn. And if he takes here, I can take here check and then get another passed pawn instead. and he can't take with a pawn because it's pinned. So Stockfish is being clever and playing pawn here instead of playing a5 or rook a5 and guarding the pawn. So you can see that if he had played rook d8, I'd have some choices on how I would try to win the game, and none of them are trivially easy. You know, I'm good enough that I should be able to win the game without too much trouble when he does that. But I thought resignation when he has such a move is premature. Now let's say he doesn't do that. If he plays a silly move like king to e5 and I just play rook here and he plays king back and I play here, well, that's a different story. Now I have connected passed pawns and I could at my leisure just bring my king over to the queen side and win this game easily. So if he would do that, then I can understand why he would resign. But the fact that in the final position he has a move like rook to b8, which causes me at least something to think about, I think he probably should have done that rather than resign. But, you know, if he was playing Stockfish, Stockfish would have said, hey, I'm up 6, I'm winning anyway, no problem. But that would have caused me at least something to think about. All right, so this was a game where I had a big plan. Let's go back to that key position. Now that you've seen the rest of the game, you can see how important that move was. Back on move 17. So the whole game turned around right here. Here the double pawns aren't so bad. I can't create a passed pawn with my 3 on 2 because his d pawn on d6 is stopping my c pawn from coming up. It's really 3 on 3. But this move here gives me a chance to isolate the left side of the board with 2 on 1. And now these double pawns aren't doing very much. And his missed opportunity to grab the file here made things a lot easier. When he took the pawn and let me play queen up and then grab the file, he had to trade everything off, and I got into that pretty easily winning endgame. So it's one of those rare games where you can actually look way ahead and say, gee, all I have to do is do this and this and this and this and this, and I should be able to win the game. So even though I'm equal in material, the fact that I have that 2-on-1 majority on the queen side and he doesn't have a comparable mobile majority on the king side is enough to give me a theoretically winning advantage. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. You could tell your friends about my channel. That's the best thing you can do. You can subscribe. We're trying to go for 5,000 subscribers. We're about 100 short, so if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button. Appreciate it. And you could like the video as well. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.